A decade sings its swan song on Metroidvania Works episode 21.
You know, you two could drive a man to drink.
Me? What did I do?
Well, now we're getting somewhere. Someone must have forgotten to give Sega and Westone the memo that exploratory action games had fallen out of favor by 1989. But that is okay. Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap may have belonged to a genre rapidly falling out of fashion, but it's a masterpiece all the same. A strange, wonderful little burst of isolated genius. Besides, it's not like Sega actually released this in Japan, despite giving it a Japanese title screen and adding a special alternate soundtrack for the Japan-only FM sound unit. The console version of Wonder Boy 3 only shipped in the Americas and Europe, where in 1989 games like this were still on the upswing due to the localization gap of the 8-bit era. And really, regardless of timing, a great game is a great game. Wonder Boy 3 gives us the purest, most robust distillation of the Metroidvania concept yet seen to this point, and probably the most polished as well. Although it barely resembles the original Wonder Boy, a wholly linear attempt to do the Super Mario Bros. Thing all the way down to the way it spanned 32 stages across 8 worlds, The Dragon's Trap came by its design naturally. In arcades, the original Wonder Boy featured an on-screen status bar that depicted the hero's current weapon selection. This element evolved into a proper inventory system, complete with an economy, for the sequel, Wonder Boy in Monsterland. That game felt very much in keeping with the likes of Fantasy Zone and Capcom's Black Tiger, giving players some trappings of an RPG in the form of shops in which to purchase upgrades, while still maintaining a linear flow. Wonder Boy 3 builds on that game, literally. A direct sequel, the title screen for the Japanese release calls it Monsterland 2, not Wonder Boy 3, this adventure begins by dropping players into the final battle of Monsterland, fully kitted with weapons and gear and massive health upgrades, and letting them duke it out with that game's final boss in a fight tilted to be more or less impossible to lose, a gimmick that Konami would borrow nearly a decade later for the definitive Metroidvania, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. However, this game retcons Monsterland's ending by afflicting the protagonist with a curse upon the Mecha Dragon's defeat. Canny viewers will observe that this conceit had previously appeared in Castlevania II Simon's Quest, in which Simon Belmont set out to purge himself of a curse that Dracula had placed on him at the end of the original Castlevania. It's borrowing all the way down. But however much Wonder Boy and Castlevania may or may not have deliberately borrowed from one another, this game has a tone and feel all its own. The prologue ends with Tom Tom transforming into a lizard man with terribly reduced stats, rushing to escape the collapse of the dragon's castle in classic Metroid style before striking out on an all-new adventure that spans a huge and largely open world. Wonder Boy 3 more or less leaves the player to their own devices in order to complete the quest that the dragon's curse has thrust upon him. A few NPCs appear throughout the world, but they tend to be utilitarian in nature, selling you equipment and providing you with health restoration for a price. From the outside of the adventure, you can strike out along multiple paths from the central town that serves as the hub of the quest. To the east, you have a series of islands reminiscent of the original Wonder Boy. To the west, a desert that ultimately leads to a pyramid. Along the way, you can spot inaccessible caves, underwater grottos, and building interiors, all designed to draw your eye and entice you with the prospect of exploration, eventually, once you figure out how to access them. This process involves lots of exploration and poking into out-of-the-way corners while battling hosts of monsters, gathering cash, and buying cool new gear. At the most basic level, the keys you need in order to open new areas are simply that, keys. Find a key, unlock a door that grants you access to a new building, or activates a portal to a new space. But your primary means for exploring the world comes in the form of something hinted at in the game's title. The Dragon's Trap may have cursed Tom Tom, but that curse also grants him unique abilities. As you venture through the world and defeat the various dragons who rule the land, Tom Tom will find himself stricken by additional curses that turn him into different Beastman forms. These alternate bodies don't simply change your appearance. Each one grants the hero new physical attributes that open up more of the world to exploration. For example, each monster form can only equip certain types of gear. You begin the adventure proper as a lizard man who breathes fire as his main form of offense and can't fully benefit from the power boost conferred by swords. However, as a trade-off, the lizard man form can unleash ranged attacks, giving him the safety of distance from foes. By contrast, the diminutive Mouseman form has terrible range with his tiny little sword, which means he can only attack by getting in close to foes. But only the Mouseman can slip through tiny gaps in the level design and cling to walls and ceilings, granting him the ability to venture into areas that the other forms can't. The Fishman form can move with agility underwater, meaning that you can venture into new areas by moving through lakes and underwater pools, and so on and so forth. While you never stop relying on plain old keys to unlock critical spaces, especially boss chambers, Wonder Boy 3's emphasis on the protagonist's physical form and innate abilities to open up further exploration is a great expression of a fundamental rule of the Metroidvania format that goes back to Samus Aran and her Morph Ball. It's quintessential Metroidvania, especially once you gain access to the ability to transform between bodies at will. Ultimately, of course, you want to get your protagonist back to the human form they started out in. But the Dragon's Curse doesn't seem quite so bad when you stop to consider how it empowers the core gameplay loop. And while Wonder Boy 3's world may appear at a glance to consist of long horizontal passages, once you actually begin to pick your way through its spaces, you begin to realize that they contain plenty of intricately interlocked passages, and tantalizingly visible, yet inaccessible spaces that beg the player to revisit them once they've acquired the necessary skills or body. Wonder Boy 3 rewards the attentive in a way that no game before it had. Consider the tower in the hub town, which contains a single wall of checkerboard blocks rising out of sight. The first time you spot this wall, you don't even notice it. You have no reason to think that particular wall pattern has any significance, since the town's structures contain a variety of different blocks and tiles. But once you transform into the Mouseman, you eventually come to realize that body can make use of checkerboard blocks to scramble up walls and along ceilings, meaning that one structure at the outset of the adventure contains a secret that only becomes relevant and visible once you defeat the first boss. Likewise, the Fishman form, with a little help from Mouseman, can acquire a special sword whose mere presence in the player's inventory allows you to break a certain type of nondescript block. Once you comprehend that blade's capabilities, your mind immediately casts back and begins to race as you review the world to track down where you may have seen that particular style of block before. Wonder Boy 3 rewards players for going out of their way to explore. Drop into a pit or plunge into the water, jump off of the top of the screen, nudge a seeming dead end. More often than not, you'll earn something for your efforts, whether it's something as basic as extra health or consumable sub-weapons, or as vital as a permanent health upgrade. Westone created a true classic in Wonder Boy 3, one of the best designed 8-bit games of all time. A game so good that its visually enhanced remake for modern platforms in 2017 did very little to change the underlying content and mechanics besides adding crisp new art and animation, yet still managed to feel like one of the best Metroidvania releases of the decade. That's true timelessness. Even at the time, Sega and Westone knew they had something special. Wonder Boy 3 shipped for a variety of 8 and 16-bit platforms under an assortment of names and properties, but the core action, systems, and world design remained fundamentally consistent across releases. The game proved especially influential in Europe, but it's hard to believe it didn't have its share of fans in the US and Japan as well. Especially when Takeru's Little Samson featured the ability to swap the human protagonist for a team of different beast allies, including a mouse with more or less the same skill set as Tom Tom in Mouseman form. Even though the game industry's 8-bit explorations into the Metroidvania format had begun to wind down by the time Wonder Boy 3 appeared, at least the format didn't fade away. Thanks to Westone and Sega, it rather went boldly into that good night. Perhaps the 8-bit Metroidvania boom was destined to end with the Showa era. As the Heisei era took root, games like Wonder Boy 3 would become rare sights until the indie Metroidvania boom nearly 20 years later. Heck, Wonder Boy 3 didn't even ship for Mark III, failing to make its way to Japanese retail shelves until the PC Engine adaptation arrived in 1991. But at the same time, the action RPG precursor to the Metroidvania format underwent a surprising revival. Up until 1987 or so, action RPGs usually looked more like top-down action games than side-scrolling platformers. Adventure highlighted the Tower of Jiraga, Dragon Slayer, Ys, and of course, The Legend of Zelda gave players their best fix of expansive RPG ambitions combined with intuitive pick-up-and-play action. That format largely vanished for a couple of years as the action RPG bifurcated into platformers with RPG components and pure RPGs in the Dragon Quest vein. But just a few months into Heisei, wouldn't you know, Capcom brought it back into focus in a meaningful way with the excellent Willow for Famicom and NES. And moving into late '89 and 1990, the Zelda-like action RPG would rise to fill the vacuum left by the vanishing Metroidvania. Although, as Neutopia and Golden Axe Warrior demonstrate, it took a little while for developers to come up with a direction for their efforts beyond "we have Zelda at home." Both Neutopia and Golden Axe Warrior, developed by Hudson for TurboGrafx-16 and Sega for Master System respectively, add very little to the genre besides slightly nicer graphics. They both come off as Nintendo's competitors reverse engineering the original Zelda in order to figure out how this whole thing works. Of the two, Golden Axe Warrior plays the most like Zelda. Actually, that might be understating the similarities. Golden Axe Warrior drops players into a vast open world that they can traverse with a fair amount of freedom, although venturing into the mountainous north poses greater dangers than the neophyte adventurer can probably survive. As you move around the world in search of the 9 dungeons you need to conquer, you collect cash from fallen foes and reveal hidden passages where old men give you money or sell you goods. The monsters in the world include goblin-like guys who shoot arrows at you, fishmen who pop out of the water to spit fireballs that your basic shield can't defend against, creatures that emerge from the sand, and many other critters taken straight from the Zelda bestiary. Inside the first dungeon, you face bats and skeletons, just like in Zelda. It's quite shameless, though Golden Axe Warrior does add a few elements to mix things up. For starters, you can find actual towns scattered throughout the realm, where you can shop, rest to recover health, and save your data. And the game maps all of your actions to a single button, giving you a variety of different weapons that have distinct functions. For example, the sword can activate switches, while the axe can clear away shrubbery, a feature that Secret of Mana would borrow a few years later. Overall though, Golden Axe Warrior just feels like Sega doing Zelda. It's faster paced, brutally difficult, and ultimately just a more arcade-like take on Nintendo's game. Neutopia, on the other hand, mixes things up a little more. It divides its world into 4 elemental zones based on key treasures stashed there, grants the protagonist a variety of magical powers, and generally locks the gameplay progression into a fairly linear system. It's also the best looking of the Zelda clones to that point, with a crisp visual style that would be echoed in Super NES games like Lagoon and Paladin's Quest. Although far more limited than Zelda, it also has the benefit of being much more direct in its goals and secrets, eschewing the blind searching and idiot luck required to complete older 8-bit titles in favor of clarity and intuitive design. While both of these games feel a little underwhelming, doing so little to innovate within the space, they mark a sort of relaunch for a genre that had briefly subsided. Before long, we'd see some real advances in the Zelda-esque action RPG space. That includes the third Zelda game, a return to this format that would become one of the most structurally influential games of all time. Not to mention the work that most directly inspired the definitive entry in the Metroidvania genre, Symphony of the Night. Would we have had A Link to the Past, and therefore Symphony of the Night, without Golden Axe Warrior and Neutopia? Well, yes, probably, but it's still interesting to see this soft reboot for a subgenre that had briefly seemed to be in danger of vanishing. Next time on Metroidvania Works, we go blob blob blobbing along.